This is a lightsaber blade from Galaxy's Edge, and it's been modified. It has in it a custom blade controller that I designed to give the blade more colors and animation effects. I've published a series of videos that cover how to make one of these blade controllers, how to program it, and how to install it into a blade. If you're interested in how to make your own custom blade controller and get an idea of what's involved in that, I'll have a link to a playlist in the description below that will take you to all the videos in this series covering how to make and install one of these blade controllers. In this video, I want to go over how to use the custom blade controller. The GitHub repository, where the source code for the firmware resides, contains a README file. And included in the README file is a section called Blade Controller Operation, where it goes over how you can control the blade and what different display options and animation modes are provided by the blade controller. If there's anything in this video as I demonstrate this blade controller that doesn't quite make sense, try looking at that README file, which might better explain things. The first thing I want to cover is understanding how the blade can be controlled by the hilt. When we plug the blade into the hilt, we don't have access to those switches. There are no buttons here, so we have no means to send commands to this blade except by turning the hilt on and off. When we turn the hilt on, it sends a command to turn the blade on. When we turn the hilt off, it sends a command to turn the blade off. What the blade controller will do is when it receives a signal to turn off, it will start counting. And if you turn the blade back on within a certain period of time, it will change its settings. If you turn the hilt off and then on again, within 1 second, it will cycle to the next display mode. If you turn the hilt off and then on again after 1 second, but before 3 seconds, the animation mode for that display mode will change. So it all comes down to how quickly you turn the blade off and then on again. That allows you to control how the blade is going to behave. Before I demonstrate the blade, I want to give you a couple of tips, things to look for to see how I am changing the display mode and the animation modes. The way I look at it for timing is if I want to change the display mode, I can just bring the hilt off and then on again. Just as quick as that. When I want to change the animation mode, we need to go between 1 and 3 seconds. And the way I do that is I turn it off, I wait for the blade to extinguish, the animation sound of the blade extinguishing also finishes, wait half a second and turn it back on, and that will change the animation mode. That's how you can more easily gauge that you're within that 1 to 3 second window when you turn it back on. To demonstrate the custom blade controller, I am going to insert it into this hilt here. It's a Savvy's Workshop chassis with just the switch plate attached to it. You can see from the window here, it's flashing white. That means it's a white crystal. The blade is going to be sent the command to ignite white. And the custom blade controller's first display mode, the display mode it's going to start out in, will be in a stock blade mode. So it should ignite white. And it does. Now, if I want to go to the next display mode, which is a color picker mode, I need to have the blade on, and then turn it off and then on again within 1 second, like this. And now it is in a color picker mode. And what it's doing is it's cycling through different colors. And when you see a color that you want, you turn the blade, or the hilt I should say, off and on again very quickly, and that'll send it into the next display mode, which is the color picked mode. So, do it like that. I now have a purple blade, despite the crystal being a white crystal in my hilt. There are a couple of other display modes. This display mode is a color cycle mode. The whole blade is just cycling through continuously all the colors of the rainbow. The next display mode after that is the same effect, but each segment in the blade is cycling slightly out of phase from the other colors. So it sort of looks like the color is sliding down the blade. And then the last display mode is the segmented color mode, where each segment gets a separate color. Galaxy's Edge lightsaber blades are made up of 4 segments of LEDs. Each segment is controlled separately by the blade controller, so that allows us to set different colors for each segment. How do I get a different set of colors in that segmented display mode? To do that, you need to perform an animation change command. This is the turning the blade off for between 1 and 3 seconds and then turning it back on. So I'll do that, and we'll go through a couple more of those segmented color modes, and we'll see how that timing works, how you watch the blade extinguish, wait for the sound to finish, give it a half a second, and then turn it back on. So I'll ignite in this multi-segmented display mode. Okay. And now I'll turn it off. And then on again. And that has changed it to a different segmented display mode. This one's a little more subtle. This is a red to orange blade. This one is a yellow to green. We have a bright purple to a dim purple. This is actually possible in the color picker mode. Orange from bright to dim. I'll show you how to get that gradient color from bright to dim in the color picker mode in a little bit. But as I'm going through this, I'm hoping you sort of get the idea now of the timing of turning the blade off, wait for the audio to stop, and then give it half a second and turn it back on. And you'll be cycling through animation modes like a pro. And now I'm back to the beginning of that, of the different color options available in this multicolored segment display mode. And that was the last display mode. It's gone back now to the stock display mode. So that gives you some idea, hopefully, of how the timing works on this, how to change display modes, and how to change animation modes. And I call it animation modes, but you notice when I was doing that multi-segmented mode, I'm not changing the animation, I'm changing the colors. That's just a term I'm using right now. I might change it to something else, maybe display sub mode, which is actually what I originally called it until I figured that was a really boring way to term it in the README file, and I changed it to animation mode. Anyways, how things are named doesn't matter too much, just as long as you understand what the terminology means. So now I want to look at the animation modes of the blade when it's got a solid color on it. So these animation modes will apply to the stock display mode and to the color picked mode. So I will ignite this. We're in the stock display mode right now. And if I turn it off and then on again, we are into the different animation modes. We had the first animation mode, which is just a solid color. Now we've got a full blade flicker. The whole blade is flickering, and it's all flickering in unison. Second animation mode, each segment is flickering separately of the others. This is the third display mode. The way this works is the first segment pulses with electricity, and that pulse is propagated down to the end of the blade. And the sections will regularly dim themselves. So like the pulse of electricity hits, it flashes the whole blade, and then it dims, and then another pulse comes through, the blade gets bright again, and then it dims. All of this is done randomly. So the effect is there's no pattern to it. Next animation mode is sort of like the inverse of that. The blade is bright, and then there are these little pulses of darkness that get carried down the length of the blade. This next animation mode is a little bit different. The base pulses, and that brightness of the pulses carries down each segment, but it also gets dimmer the farther away from the base you get. I call this the gradient pulse, but I also think another way to look at it is this is kind of like a candle flicker effect, where the brightness is down here and it gets dimmer towards the end, like a flame. This next display mode is breathing, where the blade just pulses in and out. Now we have the gradient mode, where we have a bright blade down here, and it gets a little bit dimmer up here. Not very dim, maybe 50% less. The brightness difference on the second gradient mode is much more noticeable. The tip is much more noticeably dim in this mode. And then the last three animation modes here are just different levels of brightness. I probably don't need that, but I'm leaving it in for now. And the reason I say I probably don't need this brightness change anymore is in the color picker mode, there is also an option to change the brightness of the colors, which we'll get to in a moment. This is not very noticeable to me, but this is a 66% brightness. This is a 33% brightness. Now it's a little bit more noticeable to me. And this is a 10% brightness. This is a very dim color. But what's also important to note is that if you're in a very dark area, if it's night outside, the blade will still be very visible, but because it's only using 10% of the brightness, it's only using maybe half of the battery power that the other modes need, so you're actually saving battery power. It's just an option. I want to go now into the color picker mode because there are a couple of interesting extras there. The first thing I want to talk about before I get into it, and we have the background noise of the blade running. When I go into color picker mode, the colors you can pick from, I think there's only like 8. And maybe you want more choice in color than that. If you send an animation change command, the number of available colors will double. And keep doubling every time you do that, up until 64 colors, I think, and then it will loop back around to just the first 8 colors. The reason I'm not providing just 64 colors right away is because sitting through 30 plus colors to get to the one you want can take a little while. So in this way, you could put it into the default 8 color mode, and then when it gets to blue, and you know you want something between blue and red, you want a pink color, then you can send it a couple of commands to increase the number of colors, and you'll only have to sit through 4 or 5 colors to get to the one that you want instead of 60 colors. At least that's my theory behind it. Whether or not people actually see it that way, well, that's up to you and everybody else who uses one of these custom blades. So let's get into that color picker mode. We are in stock mode. Now we're in color picker mode, and it's cycling through all those colors. And I've now increased the number of colors. So now you saw there were like 4 different pink options there, whereas before there was just one. Now orange is available, whereas before it went from red right to yellow. Now we get red, orange, then yellow. There we go. So now we really have a lot of choice here in terms of what color we want the blade to be. So say you want a pink color, another friend wants a pink color, but you want to have different pinks. One can have a cool pink, one can have a warm pink. There are a lot of options here. Just like, some people don't like the greenish tint to that yellow that stock blades have, but if you want to recreate it, you can with this. Aquamarine color, different shades of cyan. The options are everywhere now. So you can find a color that you'll want by increasing the number of available colors in the color picker mode by sending it that change animation command, like that. Now there's one other feature to the color picker mode, and this is an option that's right now unique to the color picker mode. We have more than just the switch to send commands to the blade. The hilt will detect a clash. That is when your blade hits somebody else's blade. And it will send a command to the blade to quickly flash to a white or yellow color to indicate a clash has occurred. The hilt detects a clash by the hilt suddenly stopping. So if it moves at a certain speed and then suddenly stops, it will detect that as a clash and send the appropriate command to the blade. In color picker mode, if you send a clash command to the blade, it will change the brightness of the color. There are 5 levels of brightness, and then there is a white. By using the color picker mode and this brightness feature, you can achieve, for example, a white blade, which otherwise wouldn't be available because when you're cycling through all the different colors of the rainbow, you never get to white. This also lets you change the brightness, or maybe a better word is color saturation. You'll notice as the blade color becomes brighter, it also starts to become washed out. So a blue might suddenly become more of a powder blue or more of a pastel color. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So the color picker mode starts out in sort of the middle default color brightness. There are 2 higher brightness levels, and then white, and then it will cycle over to a dark setting, and then a less dark setting, and then back to that middle brightness. So 6 brightness levels in total, 2 above, 2 below, the default brightness in the middle, and then also a white color. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to bring the blade into that color picker mode, but with only the first 8 colors being available instead of cycling through 60 different colors. Here we are in color picker mode. Now I'm actually going to dim the lights here a little bit so the brightness makes a little more sense maybe on camera. So I'm going to send a clash by quickly thrusting the hilt in one direction and then stopping it, like that. And that's a slightly brighter blue, and that's even brighter. And now we're in a white blade, and it will stay white. It will not cycle out of the white color until you give it another clash, and then we're at the dark brightness level, the less dark brightness level, and the regular brightness level. You might notice also when you send that clash and it changes the brightness, the blade will hold on that color for a few extra seconds. So if you want to cycle through all the different brightness levels of one particular color, you can without having to worry about losing that color, about it, the blade rotating out to the next color. Now you may recall that in the solid blade color animation modes, there were some animation modes where the blade was just dimmer. We got down to like a 10% dimness. But you can also set the brightness with sending the clash. And in fact, the two can be combined right now if you want a blade that is barely on. Which is why I don't know if it's useful leaving the animation modes that have the blade at like a 33% brightness or a 10% brightness, or if I should remove those and just let those brightness levels that you can set with the clash be how you set the brightness. This is something I don't know what would work best, so I leave them both in just to provide more options. But let's have a little fun with that. How dim can we make the blade go? Let's find out. I think I'll go with purple on this one. Alright, so there is my color picked mode, and it's the dim purple. So now we need to cycle through all the animation modes. We are at the lowest brightness setting in the color picker mode, plus the 10% brightness in the animation mode. And you can barely see that it is on. The camera is helping it a little bit. The blade is on, but it is very dim. Why would you want a very dim blade? I don't know, but it's an option that you now have. One more thing to cover with the different animation modes. We've looked at how that animation change command affects the multi-segment display mode and the solid color modes there and the color picker. Now we have the two modes where they cycle through all the colors of the rainbow just in one continuous loop. What the change animation command will do in those modes is it will increase the speed at which the colors are changing. So when the blade ignites in that display mode for the first time, that's going to be at its slowest setting. And then sending those animation change commands will increase the rate at which those colors are cycling until you get to a very fast color cycling. And then one more time, it'll kick back to the original slow color cycle timing. So let's demonstrate that. Here is the full blade single color cycling mode. And I'm gonna, to make it more obvious that the timing has changed, I'm gonna send it several repeated change animation commands so it becomes more obvious. And it'll also maybe give you an example of how you can quickly change through all the different animations without having to look at each one in turn. So now hopefully you can see that the colors are cycling much more quickly. That is what the change animation command will do in the color cycle mode and in the individual segments slightly offset color changing mode. Again, I'll send it a bunch of change animation commands. And hopefully now it's much more obvious. You can see the colors cycling much more quickly than they were before. That covers the display modes and the animation modes and how to change between them. The next feature I want to show you is pretty straightforward. It is a built-in reset. If the color settings are weird or it's in a mode and you're not sure how to get out of it and you don't want to sit through trying to figure out all the different settings that you need to change or how to get there. If you want to just return the blade to its baseline, to how the blade was when it was first inserted, all you need to do is turn the blade on and off multiple times. Just keep hammering away off and on very rapidly. And at some point, the blade is going to cause the hilt to think that the blade has been disconnected. And the hilt is going to make that blade removal sound. And then after a few seconds, you'll hear that same sound again, signifying that the hilt believes that the blade has been reinserted. That is how you know that the blade has gone into reset. When it goes into reset, when you hear that first blade removal sound, make sure you turn the hilt off if it's not already. Otherwise, when the blade reconnects itself to the hilt, it might turn on immediately and behave weirdly. So here is how to put the blade into reset. There we go, it's gone into reset. It's out of reset. I made sure while it was in reset the switch was put into the off position. Now when I ignite it, it's going to ignite as a stock blade, solid color, white. And there it is. Another feature of the blade controller is that it can save the current blade settings. If you set the blade to some color, some animation mode, and you turn the blade off, after 10 seconds, the blade controller will go to sleep. It does this to conserve power, so if you leave the blade plugged into your hilt, it's not consuming enough power that it's going to drain your batteries. Before it goes to sleep, though, it will take whatever settings you have set in the blade, and it will save them into the memory of the blade controller. And that memory will persist even if you pull the blade out and insert it into a different hilt. This way, the blade will remember what settings you gave it. So if you have a setting that you are fond of, if you have a setting that you always want your blade to ignite as, you can set those settings, turn the blade off, wait 10 seconds, maybe a little bit more just to be safe, and then pull the blade out, and the next time you use that blade, it will ignite as those settings. Let me demonstrate. I'm going to put this into a flickering orange mode. So I'll ignite. Color picker mode. I want orange, so I need to increase the color. There we go. There's an orange blade. Now I need an animation. Alright, and I've given it this, what I'm calling the gradient pulse, but also kind of looks like a candle effect to me a little bit. That is the settings I want for my blade. And now I'm going to turn the blade off. And I'm going to wait 10 seconds. And now the settings have been saved to the blade. I can now remove this blade and put it in a different hilt, and it will ignite that same color and animation effect. Like this. And we have my flickering orange blade as I had previously set. But what about other hilts? What about a Kylo Ren hilt? Before I do this, I need to point something out. The Kylo Ren hilt is a terrible hilt to use for this demonstration, because the Kylo Ren hilt does something no other Legacy hilt does. It's constantly sending commands to the blade to have the blade change its brightness. Kylo Ren's hilt by default produces an unstable red blade, a red blade that flickers. That flickering effect is being generated by these change brightness commands that are being sent from the hilt to the blade. My code for the blade controller will take whatever color and animation effect that you've chosen. It will overlay that effect. So we're going to see an orange blade. We're going to see that pulsing gradient. We're also going to see a flickering effect courtesy of the Kylo Ren hilt. It is what it is. So I can see the unstable flicker effect of Kylo Ren, but I can also see the pulsing of the blade. I don't know how well this is coming through, but it is ridiculous. But that goes to show you that the settings are saved in the blade, and that as you transfer the blade to different hilts, it will remember those settings. One last thing to cover with the custom blade controller are these switches. These switches are optional. You do not need to install these. The blade controller will work fine without them. But if you install these switches, they offer a couple of additional enhancements into how the blade controller will operate. Currently, they're in the off position, and when both switches are in the off position, nothing beyond what I've already shown you will happen, which is how the blade would behave if you don't have the switches installed. But if you turn one or both of these switches on, some features will be enabled. Which switch does what will depend on how the switches have been wired to the blade controller. These switches are wired to a couple of extra pins on the blade controller that are labeled B0 and B1. And if you look at the README file on the GitHub repository for the firmware, it talks about what each of these switches does. The switch wired to B0 is a write protect feature, meaning after you've set the settings to your blade, the color, the animation effect, you've turned your hilt off, you've let it sit for 10 seconds so the blade will save those settings. If you then remove your blade and enable the B0 switch, your settings will be saved, will be write protected. Meaning the next time you plug your blade in, if you change the settings in the blade at all, and then turn off the hilt and let it sit for 10 seconds, what would normally have happened is the new settings would be saved, but with the write protect enabled, the new settings are not saved. So when you pull your blade out and then put it into another hilt, your old write protected settings will be used when the blade ignites. But it doesn't remove the ability for the blade to still have its modes changed while it's plugged in. The second switch, the B1 switch, when that's enabled, the blade will behave like a stock blade, meaning no matter how many commands you try to send to it to change colors or animation modes or display modes or whatever, the blade is going to continue to behave as a stock blade would. It will ignite whatever color the hilt tells it to ignite, and that's it. There are no extra modes available in this forced stock blade behavior mode. If you enable both switches, so both B0 and B1 are enabled, then you're locking the blade into whatever saved settings you have on the blade. Meaning, when you ignite the blade, it's going to ignite as however you have the settings saved on the blade, and if you try to send commands to the blade to change it, nothing will happen. The blade will continue to behave in the manner that it was set as when you enabled both of these switches. I set it up that way because I figure if you find a setting that you prefer and you don't want to inadvertently lose that setting and sort of ruin the moment by your flickering purple lightsaber blade suddenly turning rainbow, by enabling both of these switches, you're going to prevent that from happening. There's no chance that any incidental changes of the switch here are going to trigger this into some other mode. Now, I've been referring to these switches as B0 and B1. That's the markings on the blade controller. Which switch, though, is which will depend on how you have, or whoever installed the blade controller, have wired those switches up. I normally like to wire these left to right as B0 and B1, but let's pretend for a moment that we don't know how these switches are wired. How can you tell which switch is which? The easiest way is to identify the switch that does the stock blade behavior, and then try to send it a couple of commands, and when those commands don't work, you know you've identified the stock blade switch or the B1 switch. So let's do that. I am going to, I'll enable this switch here, which I believe is B1, right there. And this should ignite white. And it does. And now let's send it some commands. And you can see it stayed white. The display mode didn't change. I tried changing the animation mode. That didn't change. So we have identified the B1 switch, the stock blade switch, and on this blade it is switch number 2 here. So that was the B1 switch. That was the stock blade behavior. Now let's turn both of those switches off and let us select a mode that we want to save. Let's go with a hot pink lightsaber blade that has the base brighter than the tip. So to get that hot pink blade with the color fade, I am going to go into color picker mode. I'm going to increase the color count a couple of times so I know I'm going to get that hot pink color option when I get to the pink section. After I select that, I'll then go into the color picked mode and then start going through all the different animation modes. One of those will be that gradient color from bright to dim. And then once that's done, I'll turn the blade off, let it sit for 10 seconds, remove it, and then we can flip that switch to write protect those settings. Alright, I've got my hot pink color. Next step now is to get that dim, that bright to dim effect. And there we are. And you can kind of see segment 1 and segment 2. Segment 2 is getting much dimmer. Segment 2, segment 3, segment 3, segment 4. You can see how we're going from bright to dim. I have my blade color and effect selected. Now I'm just going to wait 10 seconds, and I'll remove the blade. And now I will enable that switch. Alright, so I've got my write protect enabled. I'm going to plug the blade back in. Now when I turn this on, we should get the same blade that I had a moment ago, which is that pink faded blade. Bright at one end, and it gets dimmer towards the other end. Okay. So now I'm going to change the settings. So as you can see, even though I've enabled the write protect mode on the settings for the blade, I can still change the settings. When the blade goes to sleep, and it goes to sleep, remember, 10 seconds after you turn the hilt off, the blade controller still has power to it. It's still running. Its settings aren't going to be read from the stored settings on the blade controller. The only time it does that is the first time it powers on. Which means if you want to revert back to those old settings, you're going to have to unplug your blade, and then you're going to have to wait. Give it about 30 seconds maybe. Now, when I plug the blade back in and turn it on, we should get that pink faded blade. And we do. There it is. This takes us to a point where I need to talk about sort of a hidden issue, a gotcha with the way the blade controller operates. And it's going to require a little technical discussion. Bear with me. To keep the flow of electricity into the blade moving smoothly so that the blade behaves well, there are capacitors Capacitors are like tiny temporary batteries. They store electricity, and if the electricity isn't flowing fast enough into the blade, the capacitor, which has this little reservoir of electricity, can sort of inject some of its stored electricity into the blade to keep things moving along, waiting for the hilt's power supply to sort of catch up. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. The point is, there is this tiny little reservoir of electricity in the blade, powering the blade controller until the reservoir is drained. Now, the blade controller, when it's in its full operating mode but off like this right now, it's consuming 3 or 4 milliamps of electricity. After 10 seconds, the blade controller will go to sleep. And in this sleep mode, it is consuming hundreds of nanoamps of current. I mean, this is just a tiniest little sip of electricity. And that reservoir can actually keep that microcontroller powered for several seconds after you have removed the blade from the hilt. So, what can happen? Well, we can go and set the blade to some setting. We'll use that multicolor mode for my demonstration here in a moment. Turn the hilt off, pull the blade out, and then put the blade back in, and your old settings, the pink setting that's faded, won't be there. It'll still have that multicolor mode going. And that's because the microcontroller, in order to load your saved settings, it needs to first turn off. And it turns off by having the power drained from it, so it's no longer running. The capacitor keeps the microcontroller from turning off for, again, several seconds, so it will retain those settings that you had set. Let me demonstrate and give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Alright. Turn the blade off, pull the blade out, put the blade back in, and I've got a pink blade. And the reason it went back to the pink blade is because when I pulled the blade out before the 10 seconds, the microcontroller on the blade controller was still in its power-hungry 3-4 milliamp configuration, and so it drained that capacitor very quickly. But now, we'll go back to that multicolor mode. And now what I'm going to do is I'll power off. And now I will wait 10 seconds and give the microcontroller a chance to go to sleep. It's been 10 seconds. The blade controller has gone to sleep. It's in that low power configuration. I'm going to pull the blade, and then I'm going to put it back in. And it is still that multicolor mode. But now I'll pull the blade, because it's still in its power-hungry mode. Put it back in immediately. And we get our pink blade. If you're in some setting and you want to quickly revert to those saved settings that you have, then pulling the blade out immediately after you turn it off and plugging it back in is one way to do that. But if you want to reset your blade from whatever it's at to your original saved settings, there's another way to do that. So here I am in my multicolor mode here. And all you need to do is trigger a reset. There we go. Now it's reset. And it will reset to whatever your saved settings are. Which also shows you that if you do a reset, it's not going to wipe out your saved settings. It retains them. So the last thing to look at is enabling both switches, which puts the blade into a locked settings mode. Whatever settings are stored on your blade controller, the blade will only ignite in those settings, and you won't be able to change the settings while the blade is active. So we should get our pink blade. There is the blade from bright to dim, the saved settings that we have. And now, no matter how I try to change the settings, it won't. It will always remain the pink faded effect. I am now going to turn both switches off. The same configuration as if the blade had no switches installed. And then I'll just trigger a reset by turning this on and off multiple times. And that will put the blade back into its baseline stock format. It will remove any saved settings. And we'll be ready to send this off to somebody who needs a blade. White crystal, the blade ignites white. We're back where we began. Final tips for anyone using one of these. You might find that it's not performing the way it should given the configuration for the optional switches. That's probably because the switch needs to be exercised a little bit. So get in there and turn those switches on and off a few times and put it back to the setting that you want, and that will probably take care of that problem. If you get into a position where you plug the blade in, the hilt turns on, but the blade doesn't turn on, the simplest solution that I have found is to just pull the blade out and let it sit for a few seconds. Let the capacitors drain and then plug it back in. If it, for whatever reason, is still not igniting, the next step is to do something to drain the capacitor completely. The way I do that is I take a pair of tweezers, and if you look at the end of a blade controller, you've got this rectangular hole, and on one narrow end of the rectangular hole there's a contact pad, and then on either side of the long sides of the rectangle are two more contact pads. Connect the two contact pads on the long side of the rectangle together, and that's what I'm doing here with the tweezers by putting one end of each tweezer into contact with the pads on either side of the rectangle. And what that does is that shorts out the capacitor. That drains any residual electricity that's in there. What can happen is sometimes just a tiny amount of electricity is still in there and it's still feeding something, keeping it alive when it needs to be powered off. And by using this shorting the capacitor method, it removes all of that electricity and it sort of does a hard reset for your blade. That is it. That is the custom blade controller. If you make one, I definitely want to hear about it. If you buy one and use it, I want to hear all about it, because that kind of feedback is going to help me in refining the firmware, refining the design, making things better. And if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Maybe the way these switches are being used right now isn't the way to go. Maybe you have an idea of a better way to use those switches. I only have two switches that I can use, but I can detect whether they're on or off in software. Should I change the functionality of the switches? Is there something else that could be done with them that would be more effective or more useful? Let me know. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. And I think that's it. I think we've ended this little journey of the custom blade controller. Good luck. Have fun.